Up next, my Holy Grail interview, the interview of all interviews. One of the last musical geniuses left on this planet tells us the story behind one of the greatest songs in the history of all of music since the beginning of time. Along with his co-writer of what many consider the greatest album of all time, it's truly a can't miss on Professor of Rock. Hey music junkies, Professor of Rock, always here to celebrate the greatest artists and the greatest songs of all time. You know, if you were raised on radio, as Journey once named one of their albums, you're simply going to love this channel. Subscribe below to get the story straight from the artists. We also have a Patreon, so take a look at that link below where we have other content, and you can also help our mission of curating music history if you choose to do so. Now, as I began to do interviews with legendary artists and songwriters and producers, I made a list of the 15 artists that I had to get before I left this earth. It was kind of my Fab 15, if you will. Artists that truly touched my life and created a meaningful soundtrack of my very existence. I've been really fortunate to interview quite a few from that list, some still remain. The near 600 interviews I've done so far, and from that list of my 15, there is one that is my Holy Grail interview. An artist who has shaped not only my life and so many countless others, who legends look to, a legend's legend, if you will. He created a body of work that, in my opinion, has never been equaled. He's quite simply one of the last musical geniuses left on this earth. When I say musical genius, I'd say of the many hundreds of legendary artists that were in the rock era, I think you can count them on your two hands, really. We've just lost a few of them over the years, Prince and Eddie Van Halen. In my estimation, there are just a few left. Stevie Wonder, Joni Mitchell, Paul McCartney, and Brian Wilson. Having already composed numerous masterpieces within the pop music canon, in late 1965, Brian Wilson remarked to his then wife that he would venture to create the greatest album ever made. Brian had heard Be My Baby by the Ronettes. Phil Spector's wall of sound production was just mind-blowing to him. And then he went on to write the Beach Boys' heavenly classic, Don't Worry Baby. Just an incredible song. Similar to that experience, he heard the Beatles' Rubber Soul, and he was just knocked out by it. It's an album, in his words, with no filler. This was the motivation to tell his then wife that he would create the greatest album ever, and the result was, of course, Pet Sounds. It's in a three-way tie for my favorite album of all time. What about you? Tell us in the comments. But how does one even try to define Pet Sounds? It's similar to, the plot of It's a Wonderful Life, where we would ask, what would life be like without George Bailey?
You've been given a great gift, George. A chance to see what the world would be like without you.
But instead, here we might ask, what would the world be like without Pet Sounds, without its healing exuberance? It's just a question that I can't even begin to answer, because for me, it would be like imagining a world without oxygen. I know, so that sounds like hyperbole, but its emotional impact cannot be overstated for me. It's 35 minutes and 57 seconds of absolute sonic perfection. I mean, it's the personification of a million heavenly angels singing in unison, that power. And to put it lightly, if you've never listened to Pet Sounds all the way through, at least a couple of times, you haven't truly experienced the full power of music.
God only knows what I'd be without you.
It's simply the highest spiritual vibration that the human ear can even receive. It's like scores of other humans on this planet. It's my go-to album whenever I feel love, joy, peace, sadness, confusion, melancholy. Hell, it's my go-to album when I want to feel, period. It contains an innocence that can't be penetrated or defiled. It was Friedrich Nietzsche who said famously, without music, life would be a mistake. I'm pretty sure that he was talking about Pet Sounds. No doubt about it. Let's be clear, it's not just Pet Sounds. It's the man who invented Pet Sounds, Brian Wilson. He's always created music that flawlessly taps into genuine human emotion. As much as any composer or artist in the history of this planet, he writes music that literally saves your life. I'll do one better than calling him a legend's legend. He's the kind of soul that geniuses call a genius. I mean, fellow musical genius Paul McCartney has said that God Only Knows from Pet Sounds is his favorite song of all time. I even remember him saying that he's given all of his kids a copy of Pet Sounds as their growing up experience, almost like a rite of passage. And I've followed this same example with my kids because everybody really should hear this record. My theory is that when God set out to create the perfect singing voice, Brian was the mold. I mean, when you hear those deeply effectual harmonies he always constructed, it just pierces the innermost region of our sacred souls, and it brings humility and a peace to our hearts. The historians all talk about the British invasion, when the Brits invaded the American airwaves with Beatlemania in '64, but with Pet Sounds that included God Only Knows, and the single released after that album, Good Vibrations. Brian Wilson, he was like the George Washington of rock and roll, winning the modern revolutionary rock and roll war by taking music to a level that even the greatest minds could never dream of. Everybody talks about it. I argue all the time with people about this. Of course, the Beatles and George Martin were incomparable in many ways. But the Beatles had, remember, 3 legendary singer-songwriters, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison, along with arguably the greatest producer ever in George Martin. But on the other side of the pond, Brian Wilson was doing all of this essentially by himself. I mean, he had the Wrecking Crew, but Brian was on a whole other level. After Pet Sounds hit and the Beatles had Revolver, the two groups were in this friendly and competitive race to take music experimentation to the next level. The Beatles were crafting Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and Brian Wilson was working with the Beach Boys on his teenage symphony to God called Smile. It's actually one of the most compelling stories in the annals of popular music. I've studied it for years. It's a story, actually, that I've been collecting interviews and a lot of stories about, and we will definitely be releasing something like that soon. But our precursor to that, I want to share the story behind the songs from Pet Sounds, which I had the distinct honor to talk with Brian Wilson about. It was a pinch me moment for sure. We're going to start with God Only Knows right now. One of the most shocking things about the masterpiece, God Only Knows, is that it didn't even make the top 20 charts, even though it was one of the most celebrated songs of all time since then. Arguably the jewel and the crown of Pet Sounds. Of course, I love Caroline No as well. And
Oh, Caroline,
I mean, I love them all, but God Only Knows by the Beach Boys was the B-side of the number 8 hit, Wouldn't It Be Nice? I assume most of you watching know about the A-side and B-side psychology of the 50s and 60s, but I guess for those who don't know, the A-side would normally be the song that the record company wanted radio stations to play, and sometimes both would be played, and both became hits, hence the term double-sided hits or double A-sides. We've talked about it before. Beatles achieved this a lot of times, and we've talked about that a lot, with Penny Lane on the A-side as an example, and Strawberry Fields Forever on the B-side. Penny Lane hit number 1, and Strawberry Fields went to number 8.
Penny Lane is in my ears and in my eyes. Strawberry Fields Forever.
In the Beach Boys' case, the A-side, Wouldn't It Be Nice, was pushed as the hit, and God Only Knows was the B-side. In the UK, it was just the opposite, actually. God Only Knows was the A-side hit, went to number 2, again denied the number 1 spot. In America, God Only Knows it did get airplay, and actually did end up charting on the Hot 100. It went to number 39, barely scratching the top 40. It's a travesty of epic proportions. It's one of America's greatest pop standards, like I said. So great, in fact, that although Brian Wilson has told many that he was influenced by the great George Gershwin's standard Rhapsody in Blue, it was a big influence on him. When Brian created God Only Knows, I think like George Gershwin had met his equal.
God only knows what I'd be without you.
Thought about it a lot. God Only Knows might be Brian Wilson's masterpiece. But it's tough to say for sure. I mean, you have good vibrations.
Vibrations are happening with her.
California Girls.
Wish they all could be California.
Don't Worry Baby. And I could keep going and going. I think you get the point. How many artists outside of the Beatles have that many perfect songs? Flawless songs. The vocal arrangement alone is just otherworldly.
So what good would living do me?
Now, there are many outtakes of God Only Knows, some of which feature Brian singing lead. But in the end, Brian gave his baby brother Carl the lead vocal. But in this upcoming story, behind this song, you're going to get the real story. It's pretty interesting. God Only Knows continues to just mesmerize our culture. It's used in film and TV all the time. I mean, there's Toy Story 4, Love Actually, Boogie Nights, Big Love, The Leftovers, The Wonder Years. I love how they used it there.
God only knows what I'd be without you.
Grace and Frankie, and of course so many more, and it'll continue to get used, of course. It's also been covered by scores of different artists. I mean, there's Neil Diamond, Olivia Newton-John, Elvis Costello, Michael Bublé, David Bowie, Avenged Sevenfold. Are you kidding me?
God only knows what I'd be without you.
Like I said, though, it's Sir Paul McCartney's favorite song ever. Now, what follows is the story of God Only Knows from its creators, Brian Wilson, and his co-writer, Tony Asher, advertising exec from back in the day, and a few other interviews. As we go into this interview, I want to thank our sponsor, Zenni Eyewear, the instrument that I choose to see the world through, if you will. At Zenni.com, you can actually customize your eyewear with a prescription lens or a non-prescription lens if you just want a great look or a certain color or a particular style of lens. Check it out today at Zenni.com. Here's the story. Rubber Soul came out. I've got a copy of it right here. Rubber Soul came out and you heard that, blew your mind, and you wanted to write an album of all great material.
Yeah, I went to the piano after I heard Rubber Soul, and I started writing God Only Knows.
Did you consciously plan a concept album, or did you just write songs?
No, we didn't plan it. We just wanted to do an album that had ballads and rockers and rock ballads and stuff like that,
A real heart and soul album.
Right, it is a heart and soul album. Yeah,
Yeah.
very much, yeah.
This is an album that whenever I've gone through anything, from happiness to sadness,
Right.
this is the album. One of my favorite albums of all time. And,
Thank you very much.
And many people's. But
Very nice of you.
let me ask you about why Tony Asher? Because he was in advertising. Why did you choose him to write that with?
We met because I went to a recording session for some jingles that I had to record. And I somehow came upon Brian at, like the water cooler or the coffee machine or something. And I was in the hallways and there was Brian Wilson. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's Brian Wilson. So I said to him something really original, like, you're Brian Wilson.
I talked with him,
And he said, hey, come here and listen to something. Now, that's the kind of thing Brian does.
and I said, you have a very, very good gift of gab,
If we were in the studio today and he was working on something and we just appeared in the hallway, he would say, hey, you guys want to listen to something? I mean, he did it with the FedEx guy who would come to the door and he'd be mixing something or whatever. And then he'd take the thing and he'd sign. He'd say, oh, wait, come back. Tell me what you think of this.
I love it.
And at first you would say, Brian, the guy's a FedEx man. I mean, what are you doing? He doesn't really know anything about music. But then you stop and you say, wait a second, that's his audience. His audience is everybody.
Right.
Is every man. So why shouldn't he ask the FedEx guy? He feels like an ordinary guy, which is one of the reasons that so much of his music appeals to ordinary guys,
I said, would you like to write a song with me? And he said, yeah. So we came over to my house and we wrote God Only Knows. He wrote the lyrics and I wrote the music. We did it in 45 minutes. It came faster than any other song I ever wrote.
I remember it was pretty quick.
Wow. If Bach were to write a pop song,
Then he would write God Only Knows.
most spiritual song ever written.
I agree. I have to agree with you on that.
Spirituality has played such a huge
Right.
part in your music.
Right.
Tell me about that.
Spirituality? Well, I believe that God is music, you know? So when you make music, that's God talking to you.
We spent some time talking about the word God, you know, and can you write a song about, and as I think back, I think, well, of course, what was the discussion about? But then I realized, actually, if you go back to songs of that period and listen to what was going on, it wasn't...
God was never mentioned in it.
I mean, unless it was God
Pop
Bless
song.
America. Everybody talks about God Bless America, you know. So that was the only, you know, place where somebody was using it.
Yeah.
And then we talked about, I mean, we had some laughs because I said, do you want to call it Gosh Only Knows? I mean, I don't think we can do that, you know.
Yeah.
And then we said, so what could we do if we absolutely had to? We were serious about thinking that the label might say, hey guys, we can't put
Can't put that out there.
So what would we do? And so we said, well, because we really liked the song, you know, and we would talk about it, you know, that, you know, and I said, well, I don't know, I guess we could rewrite it, but I don't know that there's a substitute for those words. I mean, there really isn't. So, and then at some point we started to get kind of slightly defiant about it, you know, and screw them, you know, if they don't like it. This is it. This is the way it's going to be.
I just came in to hear him track something. And he finished about 2.5 hours. And I just thought, this is one of the best instrumentals I've ever heard in my life. And he went, okay, take a rest, comes back, and then says, okay, we'll put on French horns, a French horn player.
Mm-hmm.
Da, 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 da. And then at the end of the record, I'm thinking 2/4. Da, 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 and all of a sudden at the end of the record, it's da, 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 da. And I'm going, what the hell is he doing? This is not flow. I didn't know they had God only know, all these voices wrapped around it. I didn't even know the melody was there or anything.
The pinnacle of Carl singing. Why did you choose Carl instead of your own voice? Do you remember?
On God Only Knows, because I wanted him to have a chance to sing. I liked his voice, and he had a turn. I gave him his big turn, you know, for singing.
Yeah.
And he sang that beautifully.
God only knows what I'd be without you.
Carl is wonderful, a sweetheart. He had a great pure sound up top too. But he basically did Brian. He covered Brian.
Nothing to me, so what good would living do me?
Brian Wilson is truly the master of the pocket symphony. I mean, he's the Bach of rock, the king of California, and the father of America's greatest band, arguably the first. God only knows what we would be without him.
God only knows what I'd be without.
Leave us a comment about this musical genius, his music and his song. God only knows. What are your memories? What is your take on the Beatles versus the Beach Boys, that friendly competition that's going on? Let us know in the comments. If you dig our content, our videos, make sure to subscribe below so that you never miss out on our content. And make sure to look us up on Patreon for even more content. And lastly, make sure to pick up your own copy of the Heavenly Pet Sounds below. We have a link to the Pet Sounds 50th anniversary box set. Came out a couple of years ago. It includes the vocals-only tracks they talked about in it. I've also included a link to the 180-gram heavyweight black vinyl LP reissue of Pet Sounds, remastered. And there's the box set below. If you want your life changed for the better, keep the music alive, my friends. Until next time, 3 chords and the truth. Talk to you soon.